All right, everybody. So welcome. I had hoped to be here, all of us together in person. It certainly is a little bit challenging to be meeting you all from my living room, and hopefully, I'll get used to this whole idea of doing a live keynote over Zoom. So welcome. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, my name is Emmanuel Schanzer. I'm a former public high school math teacher and middle school academic coach. So it's a pleasure to be here with so many teachers. And what I'm here to talk to you about is the hashtag itself, right? CS for all. Um, CS for all has been around actually for a pretty long time. I would say in the last 2 decades, it's evolved quite a bit into what it is today. And at one point, it used to mean, CS for all schools. Like there could be a class in every school or something, even if only a few kids took it. But now, as a country and pretty much all 50 states have embarked on a much more ambitious definition of the goal, which is what does CS education look like for all students? And this is a hairy goal, right? It doesn't mean bolting on a new subject to the education system is one of the most audacious and ambitious education reforms ever undertaken in the last century. And as teachers, when we give our students a complicated, open-ended project with lots of different strategies they could use, lots of different variables, we know it's best practice to also share with them some kind of rubric so that they know what they're working towards. They know when they've gotten there. And I think it's only fair that we do the same. So if we're spending, literally billions of dollars and, millions of classroom hours, teacher hours, student hours on this project, what is our rubric? How do we know when we've gotten to CS for all? So I'm going to propose one that we use in my research organization at Bootstrap, which is that CS education needs to embrace equity, scale, and rigor. So, scale without equity means that there's like a CS class in every school, but the only kids who take it are rich white boys. And when you think about something like Code.org's Hour of Code, right, they have scale and they have equity. Tens of millions of kids take it every year. So it's massive scale. It's only an hour, so it's not that big of an ask, and so it can be done in virtually any class you want. So you get every kid involved. There's equity. But Code.org is very proud to stand up and say this is good CS exposure. It is not rigorous CS education. So Hour of Code doesn't fit the bill either. And I know that there are some teachers on this call who teach deep, rigorous computer science to a diverse group of students at your school. And that's fantastic. But until we learn how to clone you, we ain't got scale. So the point I'm trying to make is that doing well on any one of these rubric items is doable, but hard. Getting two of them is astronomically difficult. And to really pull off CS for all, we're going to need all three. So that being said, what are some of the strategies that we have access to? So over the last 20 years, there's sort of been three broad strategies that people have embraced at different times to reach CS for all. So back in the day when I first got started, there was this belief that getting into the schools would be too difficult. And the best strategy to use would instead be, well, we'll just do like after school coding clubs or out of school time programs. So summer camps, what have you. More recently, there's been a shift towards, dedicated CS classes taught by CS teachers, and the kids know they're there for CS. And then there's a third strategy that it has only recently started to become popular, which is what if we integrated computing into existing mainstream classes? So there is no CS class, but perhaps we teach some computing in the physics class, or we teach some computing in the history class. So let's evaluate these strategies according to the rubric and sort of see how they stand up. I know that we are not after school teachers. Most of us on this at this conference here are firmly rooted in the schools. But as educators, it's important to learn from our mistakes. And I want to talk briefly about why after school and out of school times that strategy didn't hold up so well. So first, when it comes to equity, after school computer science has to compete with after school music, after school theater, after school sports, which means that there's a self-selection quality here. So the only students that are going to sign up for the after school CS are the kids who already see themselves as computing kids. And so this only reinforces existing stereotypes about what kind of student takes computer science or what kind of student doesn't. So that's not a good thing. But even worse, after school computer science has to compete with after school having a job or after school taking care of your little brother or sister. And that means that the students who need to work or provide childcare literally can't participate whatsoever. So there's a real problem with equity when it comes to the after school setup. Now, scale, to be fair, after school scales really, really well, right? You can take a college kid or an engineer who has passed a background check, stick them in a computer lab at the library, and they can offer like a drop-in coding club. And you can duplicate that very, very quickly. It also doesn't cost all that much to run. So there's a lot to be gained on the scale perspective for after school. But then when we hit the rigor rubric, this is where things come off the rails. Because look, it is really hard to find after school staff that are highly skilled educators and also skilled in computing content. It's just that makes it really hard to go deep. And so you wind up with these very surface level activities. But even if you could solve that, most after school programs have, you know, fairly relaxed attendance requirements, right? 80% attendance is actually terrific at a lot of after school programs. But we teachers know that 80% attendance means, on average, kids are missing 1 day a week every single week. And so you're not going to be able to build rigor when you have such wildly inconsistent attendance. So you know, there was a period where this was the way forward. I was actually involved in running one of the largest after school computer science programs in the country. And when we saw the impact we were having, we deliberately shut it down because it was not reaching the equity or scale that we wanted. So, fast forward about 5 to 10 years ago, the idea of dedicated courses started to take hold. People rolled up their sleeves and said, it's going to be tough, but I think this is the best strategy we can take. Let's do it. So I want to spend a little more time evaluating this strategy because for most states, this is the state of the art, right? We're adding a class to the schedule called computer science. It's taught by a computer science teacher. So what are some of the challenges for this strategy? Let's talk about equity first. So, you know, if we're making these classes electives where kids can opt in, then they have the same self-selection bias problem that the after-school programs have, right? Which kids opt in to the CS elective? Well, it's the kids who already see themselves as computing interested. But of course, the other option is we can make these classes required, and that's the route that a lot of states are taking. And there's lots of other graduation requirements that kids already have to meet, right? There's like ELA or English or some literacy requirement. They have to take some number of units of math, some number of units of science. They have to sort of check all these boxes and jump through all these hoops to make sure they're ready to graduate. And every time we add another hoop to jump through, we're making it harder, and it's disproportionately harder for the most struggling students. So students that may have just barely been able to make it through and graduate, right? All of a sudden, we're adding one more hoop. We run the risk that we're just making it harder for the most vulnerable kids to finish high school. And that's a serious equity problem. And on top of that, look, if a kid fails algebra 1, their freshman year, they got to retake it their sophomore year. That's the case for required classes. And of course, if you fail a required class and have to retake it, that means you've lost an extra slot on the schedule. So if we're adding another required course, now if a kid fails their required CS class, they got to take it again the following year. So even if all of our kids are graduating on time, for the most vulnerable students, we're taking away the time that they might have spent choosing an elective, which has ripple effects on their engagement with school, their sense of ownership over their own education. Because the advanced kids get to take all the electives they want. The struggling kids have no room for anything else. And we're just making that worse if we make it a required class. And of course, when you look at who the struggling students are versus the students that are, high flyers, often if you disaggregate by race and class, what you see is, surprise, surprise, the well-known achievement gap that exists in all 50 states in this country. So I'm not here to say dedicated classes are bad for equity. I want to make that really clear. The point is that if we're pursuing that strategy, we got to be really careful to consider all of these obstacles and challenges to make sure that we're doing no harm. But there's also some significant scale challenges, right? So, if you want to have CS classes taught by CS teachers, you're going to need some certification. There needs to be some way to certify that a teacher is a CS teacher. And you know what? That doesn't exist in all 50 states. So that's going to take some time. I'm glad that Connecticut does have such a certification. That's awesome. Kudos to you guys. But then we still have to recruit and train lots and lots of teachers, right? If nationwide we just wanted to hit every ninth grader with computer science, we would have to recruit and train 20,000 new teachers. But we're not just talking about ninth grade, are we? Right? We're talking about massive, massive scale. So that's going to take more time and more dollars. And then once we have them, we got to pay them salaries. And if we're talking about CS for all, that's a lot of teacher salaries. That means adding on average about $1 billion a year to the education budget every single year forever. And As we know, adding money to the education budget is always tough. But suppose Jeff Bezos opens his wallet and just solves all these problems for us. We're still constrained by the laws of like time and space because there's only so many rooms in the school building and only so many hours in the school day. So what are we going to cut to make room for computer science? Now, these are all really hairy and challenging problems. And just to be clear, I'm not saying there's no solution, but it's going to take a lot of time to get there and to get there at scale for every kid. So finally, we look at rigor. And I just want to point out this is where the dedicated CS strategy really shines. Because if you have a whole semester or a whole year and your course is just focused on computer science, we can knock rigor out of the park. We can do so much for our students. Huge amount of opportunity. But there are some challenges to rigor if this is our strategy. One of which is if it's a required class, we cannot assume that the kids coming in have ever taken computer science, which means we have a whole year, but we essentially have to start from scratch, no pun intended. And so there's a limitation on how far we can take students. And it's challenging as a CS teacher. I think that some of the CS teachers on this call probably can resonate with this. When you've got some kids in the class who've been coding since they were in elementary school and other kids who've never programmed at all. That's a real challenge and a real headache for the dedicated CS teachers out there that want to go deep with all their kids. There's also a perverse incentive on the rigor front. When you require a CS class, man, nobody wants to be the CS teacher who holds a kid back, preventing them from being the first in their family to go to college just because they didn't understand for loops. And so, in our heart of hearts, we want to go rigorous, but we also want to be understanding. And so it can be difficult to really hold everyone to a high standard when there's a requirement like this. So let's look at our report card. When it comes to equity, right, you've got this sort of catch-22 between required classes versus electives. When it comes to scale, I mean, the good news is there's tons of ready-to-go curricula that are written specifically for CS classes. So that's definitely a plus. But again, we've got a significant minus, which is certification, recruiting teachers, paying teachers, time and space. And of course, rigor, this is like where dedicated courses should get an A+. But the CS teachers in this conference know that there's a lot of challenges to really getting there, especially when you have to start from scratch each time. So I want to be clear, I'm not poo-pooing the dedicated course strategy. Please don't get on Twitter and say, Emmanuel Schanzer of Bootstrap World hates dedicated CS classes. That is not what I'm saying. I think that this strategy has been phenomenally successful considering all of this hard work that's required. I mean, we've poured hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this at the federal and state level. We've had, every company in Silicon Valley lining up to support this. We've had celebrities lining up to support this. It's like one of the last things that both parties can totally agree on. Like the world is pushing for this strategy to work. And I'd say it's gone farther than a lot of people even thought possible. But we ain't there yet, and we ain't even close. So it's going to take a long time if this is the strategy we're going to go with. What about strategy 3, right? This idea of integrated courses. So for those of you who aren't familiar, what this literally means is you say, you pull your physics teacher aside, you pull your history teacher aside, and you say, I want you to teach some computer science in your mainstream class that the kids already take. And that's a tough order, but let's sort of see what the report card would be if we could pull this off. So first, it knocks it out of the park when it comes to equity. Because if you're doing this in, say, Algebra 1 or history or biology or any required class, right off the bat, you get universal exposure. Every single kid gets computer science. We can check that hashtag box finally. Now, there's a lot of potential here as well. If, and it's a big if, the computing material that we choose reinforces the host subject, right? If the kind of computer science we're teaching somehow actually helps kids do better in algebra, well, then we get a 2-for-1 because the kids that are struggling the most are actually getting the most help. So that would be great. It's not baked in, but the potential is there. When it comes to scale, well, hey, we're utilizing the teachers that are already in the budget and the classes that are already in the schedule. So we can scale this thing super fast, which is awesome. And once again, there's a big if here. But if the computing we're teaching actually leverages the host subject, in other words, it's not like we're just randomly introducing computer science, but we're introducing the parts of computer science that lean on history content, that lean on math content. Well, then that's a huge win, because that means that the teachers that are already masters of this content don't need as much training to come up to speed. Now, rigor is where integrated courses struggle, right? I mean, you can do a rigorous introduction to computing, and that's good. And I would argue that learning computing in context is fantastic, right? I'm not a fan of siloing these subjects into different groups that never talk to each other. So there's definitely a benefit to students learning computing not for its own sake, but seeing how it's applied to subjects like biology, chemistry, music, social studies. But I'll be the first to say, you're not going to go that deep, right? You just can't go, you can't do a semester's worth of computer science content inside a subject like history because there's already a year's worth of history content there. So let's take a look at the report card. I'm not putting after school and out of school time up here as a strategy because we've talked about why that's difficult. We've talked about why the world has largely moved on. So let's look at these two strategies. Dedicated classes have some real challenges for equity, but these can be mitigated. It just takes effort. Scale is always going to be hard for all of those reasons. Certification, teacher training, recruiting, funding, time and space. So that's the weakness for dedicated classes. And they soar when it comes for rigor. Dedicated classes can knock that one out of the park as long as we can address some of the constraints. Meanwhile, integrated classes do great when it comes to equity and scale, but they're weak on the rigor, right? It's hard to go deep in an integrated CS class. So you might be looking at these two and saying, these strategies sort of seem complementary. And if you're thinking that, you would be right. In fact, I will tell you right now that I lied when I said there were only 3 strategies, because of course, there is a 4th strategy that we could consider. What if states and schools and districts took a hybrid approach where they worked with integrated and dedicated computing classes, right? Why not let the strengths of each one complement the weaknesses of the other? What might we do? Well, so with a combined strategy, when you come to equity, boom, every single child gets a CS introduction. And in fact, the nice thing is they might get more than one CS introduction. There are schools out there that have integrated history classes, integrated science classes, and integrated math classes, which means that by the time a kid graduates, they will have had 3 different introductions to computer science in context before they ever even take a CS class. So there's a lot of equity here. This also solves the catch-22 for the dedicated classes. You don't need to fret about required versus elective options, right? You got that one checked off. When it comes to scale, there's a lot of wins here too. First of all, there's lots of entry points. So in the state of Connecticut, you might have a school with a math teacher who's totally gung-ho and says, I want to try to integrate computing. And another school doesn't have that math teacher, but they do have a history teacher that wants to do it. Integration allows there to be multiple entry points, so it can be catered to the unique needs of each school where this thing can go. In addition, we're leveraging the classes and teachers that we already have, so we can get to scale far faster. And what's nice is now we can scale our dedicated courses gradually and also organically. And here's what I mean by that. There are plenty of schools out there that are totally on the CS train. They are ready to add a dedicated course. But if there's never been one before, there's some question. Well, is the student body going to be interested? Are the parents going to be on board with this? How will they react? And there can be a chicken and egg, right? Especially if you want to offer it as an elective. If you don't have enough kids signed up to make, you can't offer the course. But if you haven't offered the course, kids don't know what it's going to be. Well, if they're already doing it in an integrated setting, you can start to find out and say, you know what, it looks like kids are really resonating with this branch of computer science. And so this is the dedicated course I want to add. Or it might be that a school they're not ready to hire a dedicated CS teacher, but they want one of their existing teachers to take on the course. Well, if you're doing the integrated approach, you can let 1,000 flowers bloom. Find out which teachers, after doing integrated CS, feel the most confident and are ready to tackle this. My point here is that you get your dedicated CS courses, but it doesn't have to be rushed. It doesn't have to suffer from the challenges of that being the only tool in our toolbox. And then finally, when it comes to rigor, look, you get the integrated classes that reinforce the content that's already there, and they engage students. So you get higher engagement. And then this is the best part. The dedicated classes can go really, really deep. And so my message to you, CS teachers that are out there that are teaching AP computer science or exploring computer science or any dedicated CS class out there, Imagine if every kid walking in the door knew about data types. They knew about defining functions. They already knew something about iteration or loops in some way. Imagine how far they could go, how far you could take them if they came in already knowing that, right? So we can unlock the potential of every dedicated CS class with a hybrid strategy as well. So you might be sitting here saying, well, Emmanuel, you're basically telling us that there's a free lunch, and I don't trust you at all because I know that there is no such thing. And you're right, because integration solves a lot of problems, but introduces other ones. And I want to give you an example. Suppose we want to integrate computer science into math class. This is sort of the most common strategy for a lot of people, right? Computing and math, they're all the same, right? Well, I'm a former math teacher, so I'll tell you, if you want to teach computing in my class, your programming language had better have numbers. Now, that seems like a pretty obvious thing, right? Now, in Java, which is a very popular programming language, Java supposedly has numbers. But if I type in 1 divided by 2, you know what I get back? 0. And if you're confused by this, you should be, because that's hella confusing if you are a math teacher or a math student. Now, to be clear, there are good reasons why Java thinks 1 divided by 2 is 0. There's different numerical types, integers, longs, doubles, and floats. And there's a good, long, engineering-y explanation. But the thing is, if you're trying to integrate this into a math class, that explanation is irrelevant. In fact, it's worse than irrelevant because it's wasting that math teacher's time. Algebra teachers are busy people. Math teachers are busy people. They don't have time to explain why numbers in Java aren't actually numbers. So I would call this a fail. As a math teacher, I also want my programming languages to have variables. That's really important. Well, there's plenty of languages out there, Python, Java, Scratch, JavaScript, you name it, where I can write the following code. I can say x is equal to 10. That's my variable x. And then on the next line, I can say, let's set x to be x plus 2. Now, when this program runs, the final value of x is going to be 12. And we call it a variable. This is like CS 101. As a math teacher, I am furious. Like, I'm taking my rings off because I've just written that x is equal to both 10 and 12. And on that second line, if I subtract x from both sides, holy cow, now I've just said that 0 equals 2. That is a serious problem. And that's because that notion of what a variable is actually mathematically wrong. This kind of variable does not match variables in math. And if I'm a math teacher and my kids are struggling to wrap their heads around variable, teaching this kind of programming in my math class, it's like asking me to drink poison. Like, I would never do that. So fail. And then finally, we talk about functions, right? Functions are typically the most challenging concept in an algebra class. They're very difficult to get across. And programming languages have functions, right? So here's some code written in a language called JavaScript. But if you know some other language, you can write this as well. And what this code does, by the way, it says function f of x. That looks really mathy. What this code does is it increments the variable foo. So every time I call f of x, I'm going to get back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I get back the next number, which means if I say f of 3 10 different times, I'm going to get 10 different answers. That means this function violates the vertical line test. And any state standardized test would demand that a student look at that and say, that is not a function. But of course, if the programming language says it is, we have an epic fail. Now, I'm using this as an example, not to tell you that these are bad languages. They are not. I love them. Kids should learn them. The point I'm trying to make is that the semantics of the language matter. And so if you really want to go through integrating into another subject like math or history or chemistry or whatever, you have to be humble about the language. You can no longer just say, hey, I'll teach whatever language I want. It's all the same. You got to pick a language that reinforces instead of undermines what that teacher has to teach. Otherwise, it's not fair to ask the teacher to teach it. So we've sort of traded one problem for another, and I want to show you a 3-part diagram that I think sums up the right approach to integration. And I should add, at Bootstrap World, I'm somebody who's been doing this work for 15 years. So I think deeply about integration. So I'm giving you, my roadmap, the battle scars that we as a team have picked up over the years. So step 1, Before you talk about your programming language, you got to figure out what your kids need to learn in that host subject. Talk to the teacher. When you pick your language, you're not done yet. You got to come up with a curriculum. The computer science world has a bad habit of developing really nifty tools and really nifty languages and then handing them off to teachers. And when teachers say, okay, cool, how should I use it? The CS folks tend to say, well, you're the teacher. It's not up to us. We think you should figure it out. And speaking as one of those former teachers, my answer is hell no. Show me the curriculum. Show me how this tool helps teach my chemistry class, my math class. And of course, you've also got pedagogy. And an example of this might be, plenty of math teachers ask their students, don't just hand in a formula, plug in a number from the word problem and make sure it does what it's supposed to do. In the programming world, this is essentially called unit testing. So if you want to teach programming in that math class, it's good to have your programming language support unit testing. My point here is that pedagogy, the language you use, and the curriculum you write all impose constraints on one another. It's a three-part diagram. And you got to pick each one really thoughtfully, making sure that you are not stepping on the toes of the host subject. So, how does integration happen, right? So suppose you bought the first part of this and you said, oh, I believe, Emmanuel, we should do integration plus dedicated CS. I'm going to start integrating CS into everything. So if you believed that, how are we going to do it? Well, often it looks like this. Someone says, oh man, I think Python is dope. How can I teach science class with it? That's what I want to do. Or someone else says, well, Scratch is really easy to learn. Kids already know it. Let's put that in the history class. Or someone says, hey, what if I had a JavaScript class where kids had to code the distance formula? Isn't that sort of like learning math? And you may have asked yourself these very questions or said these very things, and that's okay. But speaking as someone who's been doing this for a really long time, if you find yourself saying this, stop, look around, and start over. Because no good comes from statements like this. And I'll tell you why. Statements don't work. You got to start with questions. And as I said before with that three-part diagram, keep in mind, if you're going to ask a biology teacher to spend even a single hour teaching computer science, you've just stolen an hour of biology from that teacher and those students. That's a big ask. We have to be very humble if we're going to ask for something like that. So, first, does the language that we're choosing actually reinforce the learning goals of that subject? That means that step one is talk to those teachers and say, what are your learning goals? What are the hardest things for your students to learn in your class? If we don't start with that, if we come in hot saying, oh, well, this is the language we're using, we're going to miss that. Once we know what the learning goals are, well, okay, then we can pick a programming language, but we're not going to teach the whole language. We're going to teach parts of it. What are the parts that matter for that subject? A lot of CS teachers feel like you have to teach loops. If you're not teaching loops, it's not CS. There ain't no loops in math class. So if you wanted to integrate into a math class, whatever language you're picking, you need to be willing to say, I'm not going to teach for loops. They're just not part of a math class. So you got to slim down. What is the CS that really works for this subject? What are the specific standards that your CS class would address? If you walk into a chemistry class and you tell that teacher, I want you to teach computing, you better have a list of the chemistry standards that you believe your integrated course is already going to address. Because if you're not sure and you haven't done that thought, you haven't done that work, any chemistry teacher in their right mind would be totally justified politely asking you to leave the room and come back when you've done your homework. So we got to be humble about this. And if you can, cough up some evidence. Let's not forget, our fellow teachers down the hall who teach other subjects that are not computer science, they have a lot to teach in that year. And if you're going to ask them to give up even a single hour, it cannot be justified by saying, oh, you'll give up an hour of math, but don't worry, they'll learn computer science, and computer science is just good. You'll be doing good. That is not enough of a justification. You need to have some evidence that it actually helps kids learn math, because that's what their struggle is. That's what they're trying to teach. And if we can't help them with their struggle, there is no way that we're going to expect them to help us with ours. So being humble and taking the host subject seriously is absolutely critical. So I want to do a case study. I want to just, put this to the test and talk about something that is coming down the pike. Many of you have already heard of something called data science, right? Data science is really, really popular. Um, it's really the next big thing. I believe the US Bureau of Labor Statistics put out something this year that said that data science as a job skill is both the fastest growing and highest paying job skill out there. These are where the careers of tomorrow are going to be. Incidentally, they're saying that programming jobs are expected to remain flat. So let's skate to where the puck is going to be. We've got to be teaching some data science. It's nice as well because data science is a highly interdisciplinary discipline, right? I can teach data science in a statistics class because it uses a lot of statistics. If you open up a history textbook, every 5 pages, there's a chart, a table, or a graph that uses data to explain the narrative being told in the book. Data science is perfect for that. So there's lots of ways we might use it. And at the university level, a lot of universities are offering not just new specializations, but an entirely new major, right? Just up the road from Connecticut, there's a university called Brown out in state of Rhode Island. Brown University has a complete degree that's just in data science. So, and universities all over the country are adding this. So this is big thing. This is a big thing. And you can imagine that sometime in the next couple of years, there will be a hashtag, data science for all. We need data science everywhere. Data science, data science, data science. And hopefully, all of you are groaning a little bit because good Lord, we're going to fight the good fight to get computer science classes in every school. And now someone's going to come around saying we need data science classes? Oy, that's brutal. There are some folks pushing data science into schools already who are openly saying, let's kill algebra 2. No one likes it. No one needs it. We're better off replacing it with data science. Now, whether you agree with that statement or not, I'm here to tell you these are the wrong battles to be fighting because they're not necessary, right? These are the exact same battles that ground CS4All to a halt for the first decade and have made it really difficult to make progress in the current decade. If we're viewing this as a zero-sum game, where in order for data science to win or computer science to win, someone else has to lose, we are in trouble. So I want to use as a case study a research project that I've been loosely involved in. What if we were doing integrated courses plus dedicated courses that deal with data science? So in an integrated setting, right, if we're already seeking integration, well, in classes like physics, biology, and chemistry, there is a discipline known as modeling. Those of you that are familiar with the next generation science standards know that this is a big deal. And for those who aren't familiar, I'll give you a quick example. So a physics teacher might have their students roll a bowling ball down a ramp with their students stationed, every half meter with little stopwatches. And so they're, clicking the stopwatch when a bowling ball rolls down the ramp. So they've got some empirical data. And they might enter it into a spreadsheet. They might write it down on a chart on a piece of paper. And the physics teacher would ask, what do you think is going on here? What do you notice about this? Right? What do you wonder about this? And the students would come up with a hypothesis, right? A mathematical model, an equation that explains the data they just saw. Then they turn around and use that model to make a prediction. So maybe we'll predict what will happen if we use a smaller ball or a steeper ramp. And by iterating over this, right, gathering data, looking for patterns, making a hypothesis, and predicting, they're getting a really deep education in a certain branch of mechanics. And you'll find this throughout all the other sciences. That's a big deal. Now, data science fits really, really nicely into this because you can actually gather that empirical data, put it in a table, and then actually do some plotting, right? Build a scatter plot, build a pie chart, take a look at what this data is showing you. It's the exact same modeling activity kids were doing before, but now they're doing it at a more rigorous level. They can use hypotheses, right? I mean, literally, you could do a line of best fit through that scatter plot and look at the line as your predictor. So there's not even a bridge. It is the same discipline. You could use data science in a statistics class because data science is a ton of statistics. So that integration is easy, but you could also use it in other maths, right? We all know middle school teachers. We know that the statistics standards are sort of fragmented where every math class has like a week or two at the end of the year to just quickly cover the random parts of stats that have been broken up into our courses. Okay, cool. If it's on your learning objectives, if it's in your scope and sequence to teach kids how to interpret a histogram or draw a bar chart, there are elements of data science that fit that and serve that perfectly. Social studies and history classes fit this really nicely too, right? Whether it's a current event social studies class that's looking at COVID data, or looking at voting data, or a history class looking back at the Great Depression or waves of immigration. These are things that are very much on students' mind. And typically, a book will tell you the story. It'll tell you the narrative. This happened, and then that caused this to happen. And then they'll show you a table that sort of justifies the narrative. Well, a lot of teachers in these fields are sort of catching on to this idea of starting with the data, having the kids look at those tables first, and asking the students to infer, what is this telling us? And then, looking at the narrative. Well, man, that's exactly what data science is for. Let's look at those tables of economic output data, immigration data, COVID data. Let's see what we can infer from it. And then let's look at the history books and see what actually happened. So this can go anywhere. So that's awesome. If you're a dedicated CS teacher and kids are getting this intro already, you've got some nice options. First of all, if you have a fantastic class, you're teaching, like maybe you're doing APCS principles and you're thrilled with how it goes, you don't want to change it, congratulations. You don't have to, because the integrated courses will at least cover that subject. But if you want to, and that's the key phrase, you're not forced into it. Now you can choose. If you want to, you could do an entire unit on data science. And there's actually some APCS principles teacher that are doing a unit on data science for their create task. Or hell, maybe you want to do an entire data science class as an elective for the kids who want to go deeper. This is where the rigor gets knocked out of the park. Imagine if every child who graduated from high school in the state of Connecticut knew data science from their math classes, their science classes, and their history classes. They had taken it 3 different ways. They've learned just enough programming to apply it to everything. And they're ready to rock and roll. And then some of them even took a dedicated class to go deep. You could pull that off tomorrow. Well, let me rephrase. You could pull it off quickly without having to add new classes to the schedule if you have this bipartite approach where you're doing integrated and data science together. So in this research project I've been involved in, how did we do integrated data science? Well, we chose a programming language that acts the way math behaves, which means that a lot more teachers are familiar with it, because if they took math, they know how the language works. It's deliberately chosen because it's easy to learn, and it has error messages that are designed for kids to help them get unstuck. Is it a real language? Nope, not at all, but it's really good for teaching. We built a curriculum that focuses on sense making, right? Using relevant data sets that are of interest to students and that are relevant to the subject itself. You better believe that an earth science teacher is going to be using very different data sets than a civics teacher is going to be using. But they can both be teaching the same content aligned with their specific subject areas. And the final project is a research paper, which appeals to a lot of teachers who may not be coding teachers. Yes, kids have to program, but then they have to make meaning out of it. And just as an example, we partnered with, in New York City, the KIPP Charter School Network, to literally write their elementary school social studies curriculum, infusing data science throughout. And then from pedagogy, yeah, we build in notice and wonder, because that's what a lot of math teachers are familiar with. We build in data before narrative, because that's what a lot of social studies and history teachers use. And then we make peer critiques a huge part of it. Students have to present their analysis to one another, and they get to poke at each other and talk about threats to reliability, flaws in their study design, different kinds of bias. All of this is stuff that fits well in non-programming classes. And so we can do great data science in these other subjects if you're asking the right questions, being humble about the programming you need to teach, and making sure that you're serving the host discipline, not just yourself. So, I figured I would end this section with some sort of inspiring image of like puzzle pieces being connected in the background of a vague sunlight. But I think it's more appropriate to say that this is like chocolate and peanut butter. Integrated courses and dedicated courses are better together. They help each other. Let dedicated computer science classes be as deep and rigorous as they can be, right? Let's take them off the chain. Let's let them go deep. And let's also use integrated computer science classes to provide equity and scale, but we have to make them thoughtful. We cannot just go in with a hacksaw and shove coding into any subject we want. Breaking down silos means being humble about what computing is. I mean, we all sort of agree that it's a pain in the butt that these subjects are so siloed from one another. But if we want to put our money where our mouth is, if we've drunk the computational thinking Kool-Aid and we are convinced that computational thinking is in every subject, then we need to be serious about saying, if we want to put this in a biology class, how does learning any computing whatsoever help kids learn biology? It cannot be a question of teaching CS for its own sake. There's a lot of great applications out there. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease to find them and research them. And if we go out and talk to our fellow teachers in other subjects, and we try to figure out, because we've drunk the Kool-Aid, they haven't. We say, look, we believe that we can help you teach the stuff you already teach. And if we're serious about that, and we find out what their learning goals are, and we choose our language, curriculum, and pedagogy appropriately, man, there's a whole lot we can do. We can help them, and they will help us. It just means we have to be humble and let go of any, religious attachment that we have to language X or, teaching binary. Maybe that's not the most important thing for history class. So that's the end of my talk. Bottom line is, I think that there's some great opportunities for dedication and integration to work together. If we want to get serious about CS for all, we can check all the boxes, we can break down the silos, and we can help each other out. So thank you so much. I so appreciate you guys being here and listening to me talk online. All right, so I've got some time for Q&A. I'm getting the signal to pause for a second, so I will. I'm good to go. All right. So some questions here. I'm looking over the Q&A field. I'll start from the top. What does a vertical plan look like from K-8? Man, that's a good question. So I would say this. In your art classes, there are a lot of programs out there that allow students to mess around with art through very, very simple programming. I know there's some activities in Code.org's K-5 curriculum that allow you to just make some pictures. But it's not just Code.org. There's lots of other stuff out there. P5JS has some cool stuff too. Just give kids a taste. Give kids an exposure. I think at that age, exposure is really the end goal. If you're, late elementary school, 4th and 5th grade, when you're starting to get into order of operations, there is some really phenomenal work that's been done. I mean, grain of salt. Some of this is stuff that I know about. Some of this is stuff I've actually been directly involved in. But there's some really interesting research out there that when you teach computing a very specific way, you can dramatically improve students' understanding and mastery of order of operations. So I would teach just that part. The same goes for social studies. If you're having students study, what did the colonists eat? Well, that's some opportunity for some very simple data science. So this could be simply learning just enough programming to make the charts and graphs, or just enough programming to do some very simple analysis. But basically, in elementary school, I think you want broad exposure, a brief taste in every single subject you have. And if you're lucky enough to have a dedicated CS class, awesome. Go as deep as you want. When you get to middle school, I think this gets even more important, and you got to be even more intentional, because middle school is often where students start to check out. I would say in a science class, this is absolutely where you start introducing modeling. And the American Modeling Teachers Association has some great work out there about how to do modeling instruction in both middle school and high school, a lot of which can be well applied to data science. So I would do a smattering of very simple data science and very simple programming in a science class. And again, I'm not picking any particular language here. I'm not telling you what language to use, but whatever language you wind up choosing, hopefully the syntax is easy to learn and the teachers don't have to spend a lot of time learning it or teaching it, right? You want to get them as quickly as possible to using it to teach science, not learning the programming. And then in math class, yeah, there are some programs out there, including Bootstrap, where we've been around for 12 years on this, where we have integrated computing curricula that are ready to go. So you can use them to teach some of your middle school math standards. And again, if you have a dedicated CS class, fantastic. This question didn't specifically ask about high school, so I'll set that one down for now, but I hope that answered the question of whoever asked it. I see another question here. It says, would like to see how to integrate with the Title I school. Would love suggestions and help. So yeah, I mean, my suggestion is find out which teachers of your existing mainstream subjects are open to the idea. And you might face a lot of resistance. And by the way, don't be frustrated. Mainstream teachers, especially math teachers, frankly, have been burned by being forced to teach coding over the last couple of decades. I'm old enough to remember Logo and the Logo years when math teachers were force marched into teaching Logo because they were told it will help kids learn math. Now, there was some evidence that it helped kids learn geometry, but it wasn't just geometry teachers who were forced to use it. And they spent an awful lot of time and they got no results. And so they have a right to be skeptical. So please don't be frustrated if you have some skepticism. But at that Title I school, go to your teachers and find out who's open to the idea. Find out what curricula are out there. There's a fantastic project called Project Guts. They do a lot of integrated science and computing curricula. Their stuff is free. You can use it. Full disclosure, I work with Bootstrap, but Bootstrap also has free integrated curricula. We published a number of research studies about the impact on math. But it's not just us. There are other resources out there. So find the resources, find the teachers who are curious, and put them together, right? Get that teacher to go to a PD. And the most important thing, I'll say this for Title I school, but for any school, make sure those teachers have extra planning hours because they need to be spending the time doing the thoughtful integration. So if they've got the time to come back from their PD and really sit down and hammer out what it's going to look like in their class, you'll have a much higher likelihood of success. Another question. We already use graphing calculators in Excel. Isn't that considered programming? So, the word programming is used to mean all sorts of things, right? We program our VCRs, we program our microwaves to microwave mashed potatoes for 2 minutes. When we say programming in the computer science world, it means a couple of things. So first, it means that there's a specific formal language, right? So pushing buttons on a graphing calculator, there is no language, right? You're just pushing the buttons. And the reason that language is really critical is that that language represents a formalism that anyone who can read the language can understand, right? So rather than saying, I pushed this button, then that button, then that button, I can hand you some code. And if we both speak the same coding language, you can figure out what I was doing. So if you're not teaching some sort of formal programming language, whether it's text-based or block-based, that's probably not the kind of programming that the computer science standards need you to get to. Excel is an interesting case because Excel is super powerful. And there are some hardcore Excel users out there, and a small fraction of them are teachers who show students who go deep enough into Excel where they're actually writing programs. But if what you're really doing is, filling in some cells, averaging them together, making a pie chart, that's not going to let you meet the CS standards either. There's a good reason data scientists do not use Excel, and it actually has to do with that formalism of the programming language, right? I can make a pie chart in Excel, and Excel allows me to make it three-dimensional and tilt it at a different angle. And to be honest, I can use those glitzy features to sort of hide my data, right? I can skew the pie chart at a steep angle and misrepresent what I'm getting at. I can use Excel maliciously. And the problem with Excel, much like graphing calculators, is that all of these little settings are essentially buttons you clicked. It's very hard for someone to look at a Excel spreadsheet and understand how things were computed, how the chart was drawn, right? They basically just look at the chart and make an inference. Programming means they see the code. The entire process of your analysis is visible to them. They can repeat it on their own. They don't need to guess what buttons you click. So I think it's great if you're using graphing calculators in Excel. These are fantastic tools. The entire nation of France did some Excel programming in algebra class. I think it was 2 decades ago. There's some research that they came out of that. They got out of that. But as far as the computing standards, these will not get you where you need to go. Another vote says, is there any central location where I can find integration of CS for any given course subject? Oh man, that's a good question. Yep, I have it too. I'm going to upload it myself because man, if there was, I want to know about it. I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately. I don't know of anyone that exists. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. What is the best way to use CS on the 4th grade level? I've only got one key question to ask, and I ask it every time, which is, what are your learning goals? So if you want to know what the best way is at the 4th grade level, I want to know, what are the learning goals for your 4th graders? What are the things that they're already mastering quickly and easily? Because computer science isn't going to help those if they already learned them well. I want to know where your 4th graders are struggling. And where your 4th graders are struggling might be very different from where my 4th graders are struggling. So it's not about the grade level. It's not about the tool. It's about the learning goals. So pick that learning goal first. My hunch, by the way, if it's fourth grade, some fourth graders do order of operations, not all. But if your fourth graders are doing it, my hunch is that's a struggle. And so that is where I would apply computer science. And again, you got to be careful about the way you apply it, what computer science you apply, but there's some benefits there. Another question, you mentioned integrating coding into math and science multiple times, history a few times. What are your recommendations for incorporating coding into literacy? So I'm assuming this is sort of like, are we talking early literacy, late literacy? That one is sort of hard for me to answer. I honestly, I don't get the sense that learning to program is going to help students learn to read and write. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen any studies that suggest it does. At the upper level, for high school literacy, there are some interesting things here. So I've definitely seen some cool data science activities. And I want to emphasize activities, not curricula, because this is not something you need a lot of time to do in an English class, where you could analyze the specific words that are being used by different authors, right? You can build a histogram of these words, and you start to notice, by the way, that authors tend to favor certain words, that you almost get a fingerprint of that author based on the word count. And so you can do some interesting things in an upper level English class to look at your own style, right? Which authors most resemble your own style? Or you can give students a challenge. If it's a creative writing class, you can give every kid the same pre-written essay and say, I want you to write it as if you're Shakespeare. I want you to write it as if you're Bacon, right? And go from there. And the study of linguistic style and an author's style does allow you to get into some deep stuff on an upper level literacy class. And you don't actually need a ton of data science to do that. You could probably get that done in about a day of instruction. So if you can give up one class period to teach that much programming, well, now you can spend a week doing data science on your favorite authors and sort of seeing what happens. You can also use data science, by the way, for literacy to look at the evolution of language. There's some incredible data science that was done recently looking at the introduction of different names for colors throughout history. Do a Google search for it. It's really fascinating. So yeah, there's some cool stuff. Here we go. One other ones. Who are some other people to follow when it comes to integrated CS? I know Mark Gusdile is doing similar work. I would say Irene Lee does some really, really good stuff. So she's one of the geniuses behind Project Guts. I would say Rebecca Vieira, Colleen McGowan out of the American Modeling Teachers Association, the American Association of Physics Teachers, do some really good interdisciplinary thinking. Chris Orban out of Ohio is doing some thinking about how to integrate into physics. And I know there are others. Off the top of my head, these are the ones that come to mind. So I don't see any other questions, and I'm guessing my time is almost up. I think I've got 2 minutes left. Let's see. I see some really good stuff happening in the chat. SCSU has a new undergraduate major in data science. Yep. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Kids don't have graphic calculators, but they do have Chromebook. Great. Yeah, so using Google Sheets is a great lightweight introduction to data science. I highly, highly, highly recommend, though, crossing that bridge into teaching programming. And there are plenty of great programming courses that let you do introductory data science on Chromebooks. If you have more specific questions, I can talk to you about what we're doing at Bootstrap. We specifically have data science running on Chromebooks that's totally free for a lot of teachers. Yes, and Excel allows you to get into Visual Basic. That is your bridge to programming if you feel like you must use Excel. But once again, I wouldn't choose Visual Basic just because it's in Excel. I would look at the learning goals and say, is Visual Basic the best learning goal for my kids? If it is, mazel tov. If it's not, maybe look elsewhere. Anyway, I'm waiting to see if my time is officially up. I'm assuming the hook is going to come and take me away. But there's nothing wrong with letting people go early. So I just want to thank everybody for their time, for tuning in. I've got my email address on the slide, as well as the Twitter handle for Bootstrap. And for those of you that are coming to my session on fusing algebra and computer science later this afternoon, I'll see you there.